Hey, and welcome to my book talk on three great books that focus on different perspectives from World War II. In each of these books, the main characters are young adults or even children who face a great deal of hardship with bravery and a lot of creativity and resilience. During the course of these books, our characters find their voices and discover the importance of words in saving their lives. My first book is The War That Saved My Life by Kimberly Brubaker Bradley, published just this year. The setting for this novel is historical, but the characters are fictitious. The War That Saved My Life is the story of Ada, a young girl in London who's never been outside, never felt the sun on her face, never walked in the rain. In fact, she has never walked at all. Out of shame for Ada's crippled foot, her mother has always forced her to stay hidden inside their tiny flat in London, often beating her and locking her in a tiny cupboard with the roaches and the rats, a prison that shrinks tighter and tighter as Ada grows. When the war comes, Ada and her little brother Jamie sneak away with the evacuees on the train to the countryside out of Kent. From the train, Ada sees the countryside for the first time. Suddenly there was green, green everywhere, bright, vibrant, astonishing green, floating into the air toward the blue, blue sky. I stared, mesmerized. "What's that?" "Grass," Jamie said. Grass? He knew about this green? There wasn't any grass on our lane, nor nothing like it I'd ever seen. I knew green from clothing or cabbages, not from fields. Jamie nodded. "It's on the ground. Spiky stuff, but soft, not prickly. There's grass in the churchyard, on the headstones, and trees like that over there." He pointed out the window. Trees were tall and thin like stalks of celery, only giant-sized, bursts of green on top. "When were you in a churchyard?" I asked. What's a churchyard? I might have asked next. There was no end to the things I didn't know. A woman named Susan unwillingly takes them in, and although neither wants the other, Ada makes Susan join the land of the living again. And Susan has just the detachment and patience to cope with Ada's trauma. While Ada learns to stand up for herself, both literally and figuratively, she doesn't become magically better. She is suspicious and angry and terribly, terribly damaged, and most people would consider her unlovable. The kindness that Susan offers is totally at odds with the shame and abuse Ada's known. And for Ada, the most dangerous thing of all is hope. Through spies and bombs and battles, Ada learns the meanings for not only the things she sees, but for how she feels and who she is. But while you root for Ada, you know she needs her emotional armor because of what will happen if Mom comes back. Each chapter of this book ends in a cliffhanger, so I would highly recommend it as a read aloud. And in fact, the audiobook narrated by Jane Entwistle is a wonderful listen. If the hair doesn't stand up on the back of your neck when Ma'am smiles at Ada, then you have nerves of steel. But it's a really satisfying book to read on your own for everyone from middle school students through adulthood. Because it is written mostly about Ada and does focus a little bit on horses, The War That Saved My Life may appeal more to girls, but its story would really capture anyone's imagination. So that's The War That Saved My Life. My next book is also written about a girl during World War II, but not from her perspective. In fact, it isn't written from a person's perspective at all. In an interview, Australian author Marcus Zusak said, "It's set in Nazi Germany. It's narrated by death. It's 385 pages long. You'll love it." And over 10 million people did love it. Death tells the story of the book thief, a book that shows how humans can be beautiful and selfless and worthwhile. And with Death, Zusak's writing is incredibly elegant. He has a fascination with color, a billion or so flavors, none of them the same. Noticing color takes the edge off of Death's stress and helps him relax. Here's a little excerpt. "People observe the colors of a day only at its beginnings and ends. But to me it's quite clear that a day merges through a multitude of shades and intonations with each passing moment. A single hour can consist of thousands of different colors, waxy yellows, cloud-spat blues, murky darknesses. In my line of work, I make it a point to notice them." Death is funny and merciless and gentle and actually terribly sympathetic towards humans. And death gives such understanding to their lives and motives, their small desires. He's constantly surprised by humans, moved by them. Humans break his heart. Our narrator meets our main character, Liesel Meminger, on the train from Munich, where her brother has just died. On the way to her new foster parents, Liesel and her mother stop to bury her little brother. And there Liesel commits her first act of book thievery, stealing the gravedigger's handbook. She can't read and is utterly helpless and alone, so she steals words. While the story is mostly about Liesel, it's also about the accordion player Franz Huberman and his stout and volatile wife Rosa, the laundress. It's about her best friend Rudy, who is impish and incredibly funny and just a wonderful character. It's also about a Jewish fistfighter, Max Vandenberg, who paints over the pages of Hitler's Mein Kampf and writes his own story. And in this book, we'll see how wartime events affected real people. Death tells us when he's taking one of the characters we've grown to love, and yet instead of a spoiler, we hasten on to say, it can't be true. We read faster, thinking, surely not. And then it's like a freight train hitting you. Well, this book does have sadness. The characters will surprise you, changing from crude to deeply beautiful in their own flawed hearts and quiet struggles. And we think Papa Huberman is ignorant, but in the course of the novel, we see his quiet resistance, his generosity, his gentleness, his deep sense of honor. Max is a Jew who hides in the Huberman's basement, where Liesel comes home every day to give him the weather report of the sky he never sees. And on the wall, Max paints himself, with Liesel walking a cloud as a tightrope to the drippy yellow sun. And the images in this book are just incredibly vivid. People who will like this book will like books. Words have the power to change a life, to make a friendship, to wound more deeply and more permanently than a bullet. In it, there are book burnings, book stealings, book mutilations, hunger for books, starvation for words. Books are resistance. Stealing them is an act of defiance. The Book Thief is about words and writing and friendship. And that's what's real during the war, more than the bombs and the guns and the battles. My final book, Leon Layson begins this deeply inspiring memoir, I Stand in Line Waiting to Meet the Man Who Changed My Life. He's talking about Oskar Schindler, the unlikely industrial tycoon hero of the Holocaust who risked his life and his fortune to rescue thousands of Jews from the Nazis. Leon Layson was the youngest survivor of Schindler's List, so small that he had to stand on a wooden box to work the artillery machinery in Schindler's factory, hence the name of his autobiography, The Boy on the Wooden Box, by Leon Layson. Born Lieblezen in the Polish countryside, Leon was only 10 years old when World War II began. After months of incrementally crushing Jewish rights, no park benches, no public transport, no jobs, no savings, the Nazis moved all the Jews into the Krakow ghetto, including young Leon, his parents, his sister, and his two remaining brothers. One had already been killed during the German invasion. He remembered looking up at the walls as they entered the gates of the ghetto, which the Nazis, with their flair for the sadistic, had topped with rounded stones that resembled headstones on graves. So frightened and demoralized, the Jews are still resilient and resourceful, and each of the legends finds their niche in the ghetto, making and repairing and searching for food. Layson describes their fatalistic attitude as, if this is the worst that happens, meaning if this is the worst, we can stand it. But then the worst really does happen, and the Nazis began liquidating the Krakow ghetto in 1942 and sending the inhabitants to concentration camps around Nazi-occupied Europe. Leon's most beloved brother, Salik, is sent to Belzec, where he is murdered. And later that year, as the Achtung round up more Jews, Leon and his friends hide in the rafters of a shed. And here's an excerpt that is just incredibly frightening. With scarcely room to breathe, my friends and I tried to stay motionless and silent as we waited. Lying on a rafter, I could see only the floor of the shed below. All I could do was listen as screams and shots filled the air. The noise grew steadily louder as the soldiers neared our building. The German shepherds used to ferret out building and hiding. The German shepherds used to ferret out people in hiding were barking ferociously. Their handlers ignored pleas for mercy and killed indiscriminately. I covered my ears, trying to block out the shrieks and moans and cries of please and no. Suddenly my mother appeared in the shed. She had intended to bring us a teapot with water and then return to the courtyard, but as the Nazis approached, some sort of survival instinct clicked in. She set down the teapot and climbed into the crawl space with us. Packed tightly together, we prayed we would not be discovered. Then a horrifying realization entered our heads. We all stared down at the floor. In her rush to hide, my mother had left the teapot right below us. If the Nazis entered the shed, spotted it, and became suspicious, they would surely look up and discover our hiding place. We lay motionless for a long, long time. I closed my eyes, imagining bullets penetrating the rafters and tearing holes in me. We were such easy targets. After several hours, the screams stopped. Occasional shots rang out, but they came at longer and longer intervals. We seemed to have escaped the worst for now, but we didn't dare move. When it grew dark, we heard a man's voice in the courtyard saying, "It's safe now. You can come out." My eyes met my mother's, and she whispered a barely audible no. So the story is a real nail-biter, and any number of times Layson and his family are on the edge of a knife. But this bold young boy stands up for himself over and over again in quiet resistance, which ultimately is the reason he and most of his family has survived until liberation. The tension of this book is unrelenting, and never has hunger and fear been so clearly portrayed as in Layson's memoir, The Boy on the Wooden Box. If you enjoy The War That Saved My Life, The Book Thief, or The Boy on the Wooden Box, there are more fantastic books about World War II. Check out Codename Verity by Elizabeth Wine, or Bomb, a fascinating book of nonfiction on the history of the atomic bomb by Steve Shankin. Or if you're a fan of the graphic novel, you might want to try Anne Frank, the Anne Frank House authorized graphic biography by Sid Jacobson and Ernie Colon. Happy reading!